you can basically list out the key components that take you from your gross production, i.e. your billing, all the way down to your profit. So you're starting top of the funnel with gross production. This is how much that work you're doing and is billing out. The difference between that and your net collections ends up being your write-offs. So your in-network write-offs, they could be 15 to 30% depending on your situation. That's the amount of money that you're basically taking on a discount due to your financial agreement with the insurance company, as we already discussed. Next, you're going to see kind of a reduction, no surprise, for expenses. You spend a lot of money in a practice. You spend a lot of that's going to go towards wages, you've got lab, obviously utilities, occupancy, all that kind of stuff. Overhead usually ranges 55 to 65%. That's 55 to 60% of your net collections. And then next, you're jumping down basically between expenses and owner salary to profit. Now, one of the questions could be, why don't you include owner salary in profit, or why don't you include owner salary in the expenses? I think the reason is it's highly variable, and you want to understand how much of I should say, it's highly variable is probably not the correct way of looking at it. It's highly controllable, meaning you own the business, you can change that. And ultimately, you want to call that out separately. You want to look at that differently, and you probably want to calculate your overhead without the owner salary in there, because that's something you can control, where the expenses, there's fixed expenses, there's variable expenses. You can't control all of that. So basically what you're left with is the profit, and every business should have a profit. You may own the business, you may take out the largest salary and the majority of the retained earnings, but ultimately the business should have a profit, because you need a profit to save money for reinvestment in capital, replacing equipment, paying down loans maybe quicker than you have to. All those types of things come from profit. These numbers are by no means actual numbers, so don't get too caught up in them. Just think about it as you're progressing down this funnel, and each time you're taking out a sliver. The next page, we're going to cover a little bit more on the individual numbers coming from more of a industry perspective. So if you have not heard of dental economics, another great resource, there's a link at the bottom there that'll help you reference any of this information if you're interested. So what do we got here? What's important? So they've got a list of key performance indicators here, and then they've got these industry benchmarks. So this is how much, from a ratio perspective, these KPIs typically are within the industry. So some of these are important. Some of these are less important than others. Advertising, lab fees. Okay, sure. I mean, you're talking 3, 5, 10%, whatever. I think the important ones that I want to call out are, number one, overhead. We already talked about that, 55 to 60%. So this is a measure of how much of your revenue, again, going back to here, how much of your revenue, which is your net collections, are you actually taking home? So why is that important? Well, if your expenses seem out of whack, if your overhead is really high, for instance, there's one of two reasons. One, your expenses are too high. You're paying your people too much. You are spending too much in occupancy. Your lab is too much, whatever that may be. Option two, you're not making enough. If you're already paying your people market wages and it's nothing out of the ordinary, if you're paying a fairly reasonable amount on your lab costs and whatnot, maybe it's just that you're not bringing in enough money. So again, the key with overhead is the fact that it's a ratio. So ratio means you can impact the numerator or the denominator. So next, staff salary. So staff salaries, again, do not include the doctor's compensation. Sometimes you also see hygiene broken out, and that's going to become important as we kind of roll down the page. Ultimately, roughly 20-25% of all the money that you're spending in the practice goes to your staff. And that should include not only salaries, but also bonuses, other types of compensation, whether that's benefits, whether that's taxes, salary, payroll taxes, excuse me. What's the key system here? Is the staff being compensated at the market rates for their skills and abilities? I think that's the biggest question on the staff salary. Next is officer compensation. So 30 to 40%. Um, you are, as we talked about, the top producer. The dentist is the top producer in the practice. So you probably should be taking home the most. Not should be, you should be taking home the most. But you're also an employee. You're an employee of the practice. And I think where you have to remember that is you can't drain the practice of all the funds to benefit you from a personal perspective. I mean, you can do that, but it's not a sustainable model. It's not a sustainable business if you're just emptying the coffers to afford whatever you need to in your private life on an ongoing basis. So, what systems, if can you check if this 30 to 40% is out of whack? First, are you being paid fairly for what you're producing? Look at what you're producing versus what you're taking home. Is that above, way above what you would potentially earn as an associate? Because associates tend to be paid on as a percent of production. Next is hygiene production and wages. So typically, when the industry looks at hygiene production and wages, they are looking for kind of a 3x multiple or 30%. So what that means is for what hygiene produces, because they're providers as well, for what the hygiene produces, or a hygiene department produces, there should be about a 30% take home from a compensation perspective or a 3x multiplier in that if I'm paying you $30 an hour to be a hygienist, then you should be producing $90 an hour. Obviously, the difference then going towards paying off the rest of the expenses, fixed assets, or excuse me, fixed expenses, etc. So, what to consider if this number's out of whack? First is again, is the staff overpaid? Hopefully, we've already answered that one. So then the fallback is this could be a revenue issue. How is it a revenue issue? Well, let's look at some finer levels of detail. Is the capacity utilization accurate? Um, is the capacity utilization a fairly high number? Meaning, are patients keeping their appointments? Are hygienists staying busy, or are there just holes in the schedule? Does the schedule look like Swiss cheese every week? Are the hygienists producing higher end procedures? Is there enough perio? Are they doing other types of products that they're selling? Whatever it may be, there that again that ratio component is very important. Patient count. So this is more of a statistic than a financial number, but patient counts are important because it helps you just get a sense of the size of the practice. So normally you're looking at active patients. So that's somebody that's been seen in 12, sometimes they look at 18 months, and usually that's between 1 to 2,000 patients. So that's a kind of a huge number, and I was really surprised at how large that was when my wife bought her practice. Hers around 2,000, and that's just that's a lot of people to keep track of. That's a lot of people, take notes on and all that. But ultimately, it comes down to is is the size of the practice adequate to basically pay all the expenses and pay you the salary that you need to? What goes, or what is a big part of that is how many days is the doctor working? The doctor's working 2 days and they have 2,000 patients. That's a pretty busy practice. If they're working, 7 days and they've got 1,000 patients, it's a really not so effectively run practice. So all that is contextualized by how often or how many hours they're working. From a patient count perspective, it's important to watch, are you losing more patients than you're gaining? So you can certainly calculate the new patients that are coming in. That's probably the easiest number. And then there's also ways within dental software of calculating the people who have rolled past that 12 and 18 months and are starting to fall off the hygiene recare schedule. So again, important things to watch. Lastly is a measure that helps you understand how the front desk and or the insurance department is managing the collection. So AR, accounts receivable, this is how much you've billed out and you're either waiting for payments from the insurance company and or from patients. So you're typically looking for a 1x ratio. What does that mean? Basically, what did you produce last month? Say it was 50,000, $60,000. That's what your AR should be at any given point. So you don't want it to be higher because that means that basically you're every single month accruing more in AR and not collecting that on a reasonable time frame. So you've always kind of got this money sitting out there that is not attainable. And then eventually what happens is it rolls to 60 to 90 days, 90 plus days, and then at some point are you going to go back and try to collect on $15 from somebody you saw 2 or 3 years ago? Probably not. You're probably just going to write it off. So that ultimately kind of eats into what your revenue and collections are overall. So ultimately, what this helps you understand is your billing team collecting effectively and efficiently?